Imagine 1 second you're sitting happily in your aircraft seat, maybe watching a movie or chatting with your friends, and then all of a sudden you're instead staring straight out through a gaping hole in the wall as your aircraft starts rapidly descending down towards the ground below. And now picture that this is all happening because someone several months earlier just forgot to do something. Stay tuned.
Alaska Airlines temporarily grounding its fleet of Boeing 737 MAX 9 aircraft in the wake of...
In the middle of May 2023, a couple of workers at Spirit Aerosystems in Malaysia were busy working on something known as a cabin door plug that was to be fitted to a brand new Boeing 737 MAX 9. This is the newest member of the Boeing 737 family and by far the currently most economically important part of Boeing's airliner business. The part that these guys were working on looked in many ways like a normal emergency exit door, but without the components needed to operate it, and it also had a normal-sized window instead of the porthole-sized ones that was being used on normal exit doors. The reason this door plug was even needed was because the Boeing 737 MAX family had been further stretched than the older NG variant in order to be able to carry even more passengers. The passenger capacity of any commercial airliner is normally limited by the amount of emergency exits it has, which needs to be enough to allow all of the passengers to exit safely using only half of the available exits in 90 seconds or less in case of an emergency. The previous 737s had, with only one exception, been limited to 189 passengers, and because of that there were only 8 emergency exits needed. 2 in the front, 4 over the wings and 2 in the back. But since the MAX would be able to carry a lot more passengers than that, 2 new exits needed to be fitted into the design, and those were called mid-exit doors, or MEDs, and were placed behind the wings around halfway in between the back doors and the overwing exits. But the thing was that not all airlines were planning to fly their MAXes at full capacity. Some wanted to fit more spacious business class in, and others just wanted to accommodate better legroom for all of their passengers. And if an airline chose to install 189 seats or less, well, then those doors weren't needed and could therefore be plugged. There were basically 2 options for the airlines if they chose to go down that road. They could either temporarily deactivate the door, and in that case the door would retain its door handle and mechanisms, but it would all be hidden behind a normal inside wall panel. In that case the door would obviously weigh a little bit more and would also be completely blocked by the inside wall panel, which meant that the passenger sitting next to it wouldn't even have a window to look through. But it would be significantly easier and cheaper to activate that door again if the airline would change its configuration and choose to start carrying more passengers at a later stage. The second choice though was the thing that these men were now working on, a door plug. If an airline was fairly certain that they would never need to use those exits, well, then those exits could be plugged with this contraption instead. From the outside you would then be able to see the outline of the door, but the handle and the opening mechanisms was permanently removed and a proper window fitted instead. This meant that the only way that a passenger would be able to notice from the inside that they were sitting next to one of these door plugs was by the slightly bigger distance between the window in front and behind the window they were sitting next to. Anyway, once those workers had completed assembling this door plug, it was shipped over to Spirit Aerosystems' main assembly line in Wichita, United States, where large parts of the Boeing 737 fuselages were being manufactured. Spirit Aerosystems was a Tier 1 supplier to Boeing and actually formed part of the Boeing company all the way up until 2005 when it was separated into a new entity. But even after this, Boeing was by far their biggest customer and accounted for 65% of all of their business in the year 2022. But the partnership was not without its problems. Boeing needed Spirit to keep up a quite high delivery rate while still keeping the quality obviously super high, and this had led to a few issues during 2023. The delivery rate of new aircraft had actually been significantly reduced after some problems had been found with the fitting of the vertical stabilizer. And as the engineers were working on trying to fix and check that issue, another problem was found with some misdrilled holes in the aft pressure bulkhead. These issues had caused Boeing to withhold some payments to Spirit, as well as sending in their own engineers to try and solve the quality issues, and this had likely caused some mistrust to start brewing between the two partners and their employees. Now, I will get to the actual flight here soon, but it is super important that you understand how these door plugs actually work and what actually went wrong with it in order to fully understand this story. When Spirit received the door plug from Malaysia, it was fitted and rigged into the fuselage with line number 8789, which would later become the aircraft used in Alaska Airlines Flight 1282. And the way that this plug was fitted was actually surprisingly similar to how a normal door would be mounted into that same fuselage. The reason for this was that it provided the easiest and most secure way of ensuring that the plug would be able to support all of the pressure that it would be subjected to every time that the aircraft would become pressurized. But of course there were a few key differences. When the door plug was installed, it was fitted with two lower hinge fittings that would, if this would have been a normal door, allow it to be lifted slightly upwards by the door handle and then fall outwards and downwards in order to get out of the way and activate the emergency exit slide. To facilitate this upward movement of the door in case of an evacuation, two assist springs were also fitted, and curiously, these springs were also fitted on the plug, even though they would really serve no real purpose there. On the top of the opening, two rollers were fitted onto the door frame, and those fitted into two upper fitting guides on the door plug. Once the door plug was properly in its place, these lower hinge fittings and upper guide fittings were then completely blocked by the help of 4 bolts, complete with castle nuts and cotter pins. In the upper guides, these bolts were then inserted to make any movement of the roller completely impossible, and in the lower, the bolts actually went through the hinge guides itself, locking them into position and making the springs below them completely harmless. But it wasn't these hinges and guides who actually kept the door from blowing out when the differential pressure inside the aircraft would start to rise. Instead, once the door was properly in the correct place, 12 stop fittings, 6 on each side of the door, would align with 12 corresponding stop pads in the door frame, making any outward movement completely impossible. So that's how the door plug worked, and in this case it was completely correctly installed and verified by Spirit AeroSystems engineers before fuselage 8789 left the factory for its trip up towards the final assembly line at Boeing's Renton factory, where it arrived on the 31st of August 2023. And here is where this story starts to become really interesting. You see, when the aircraft arrived at Boeing, the Boeing engineers started going through it carefully to make sure that there were no manufacturing defects on it before they continued their assembly. Like I mentioned before, they were quite thorough here because they had found some issues before, and when they got to the mid-exit doors, the Boeing engineers found 5 damaged rivets just next to the left-hand door. This caused them to issue something known as a non-conformance record on September 1st, notifying both Boeing and Spirit about this issue and that it had to be resolved. Now, here is where we are going to have to go into some details that hasn't yet been released in any official report, but instead by a whistleblower from inside of Boeing. Like I mentioned before, there seems to have been some widespread dissatisfaction with the quality of the work that Spirit was performing from within the ranks of the engineers on the Boeing floor. In the months before the issues with these rivets were discovered, literally hundreds of other smaller issues had been found, and in Renton, some of the engineers were of the opinion that the whole work on the 737 should just be stopped until these quality issues had been dealt with once and for all. But of course, that wasn't possible from my financial standpoint. Boeing management pressed on to get these aircraft delivered on time, since that's when they would actually get paid the biggest bulk of money for them. So to track these issues and also provide some kind of statistical insight into the different problems that they were encountering, a kind of unofficial Slack-like communication channel had been created between the involved engineers. This was known as SAT, or the Situational Action Tracker, and it will soon become super important for this story. You see, anytime that a non-conformity of any importance was found on any aircraft, that should be recorded in an official FAA log for repair work known as the Common Manufacturing Execution System, or CMES. This ensured that the issues were both tracked, repaired and then properly checked before release, but not all things went through the CMES since it was quite cumbersome to work with. Instead, some minor things were just written up in that SAT system. So what happened in this particular case in September of 2023 was that the issues with the rivets were properly recorded in the CMES as a warranty issue, meaning that it was up to the Spirit employees that was working on site in Renton to come in and fix them. Eventually they did, and they also reported that they had done so, but since this was recorded in the CMES, a proper inspection also followed, where the Boeing engineers, to their horror and frustration, found that the affected rivets had not been fixed at all, they'd just been painted over. Unsurprisingly, the CMES file was then just reopened, pointing out this frankly outrageous issue with attached pictures of it, and it was then followed by increasingly heated exchanges on the SAT communication channel to get the problem properly fixed. When they were confronted with this, the Spirit employees admitted that, yeah, this is indeed what had happened, and they also added that a pressure seal in the door plug had been damaged during some part of the procedure, likely when they attended the rivets the second time. Now, that was actually an even bigger deal, because those type of door seals were not readily on hand in the factory and would therefore have to be ordered with subsequent delays as a result. And on top of that, in order to replace that seal, the door plug would have to be either opened or completely removed. Now, it's when this is revealed that, according to the whistleblower, the conversation that is most important for what's about to happen took place on the SAT chat forum. Because someone pointed out that they were in conversations with the door team about whether the door would need to be removed or just opened for this work to be completed. Now, from a technical standpoint, you have to remove all of those 4 locking bolts to do either of those items, but from a CMES standpoint, only the complete removal of the door plug would need an entry triggering a formal quality assurance sign-off that the aircraft then had been returned to drawing requirements. So logically, someone at some point decided that the door plug only needed to be opened, meaning that no such quality assurance check and CMES sign-off ever needed to take place. In subsequent pictures taken by the Boeing team themselves after the fix of the door seal and the rivets have been completed, you can clearly see that the locking bolts designed to keep the door in place were never reinstalled after their removal. This means that someone, unclear who or from what team, likely just forgot them, and since there was no formal post-work check required, this was just missed, maybe through a shift change or something similar. The interior panels were then reinstalled, meaning that this major quality mistake was now left unnoticed, and a major hole in the Swiss cheese model had just been passed. The aircraft then continued its journey through the Renton factory with its dangerous secret now well hidden inside of its walls, and eventually it was delivered to its customer, Alaska Airlines, on the 31st of October 2023 and then brought into service about 12 days later. And this brings us to flight 1282 on that fateful evening on January 5th, 2024. But before I tell you all about what happened there's this. When I was researching this episode, I based it partly on news reports from different US sites, but I kept getting stopped by geo-blocks on various pages. And that's where today's sponsor and my go-to tool for these situations, NordVPN, really comes in. With the help of Nord, I could easily access all of the digital material that I needed for my research, but that's not the only way that I use them nowadays. I also use Nord a lot when I'm out traveling with my family or in business to access my favorite content or just browse safely. And that's because lately Nord has become way more than just a VPN. They now also offer powerful cybersecurity tools that help you stay away and safe from hackers, malware, and those sneaky phishing attempts. I really hate those. So, no matter if you are diving into online research, want to access your favorite online content freely and super fast, or you just want to protect yourself online, Nord has your back. And if you use the link here below, which is nordvpn.com/pilot, you will get 3 months absolutely free when you sign up for the 2-year plan. Plus, remember that you can always test NordVPN risk-free for up to 30 days with a full refund guaranteed if it doesn't meet your needs. Thank you, Nord, and thank you for supporting my sponsor. Now, back to the video. Soon after Alaska Airlines had taken delivery of its brand new Boeing 737 MAX 9, it was brought over to Oklahoma City, where a Wi-Fi antenna was fitted to the aft part of the aircraft. But During that work, there was never any need to open or even to deal with the left-hand door plug at all, so even though the installation work took place quite close to it, it had no impact on what's soon about to happen. On the 5th of January 2024, an Alaska Airlines crew consisting of 2 pilots and 4 cabin crew were getting ready to operate Flight 1282 from Portland, Oregon over towards Ontario International Airport in California. When the 2 pilots were preparing for the flight, they could see that the weather was generally fine on the whole route and there weren't really any NOTAMs that were causing any concerns. The only thing that was slightly out of the ordinary was some previous tech log entries indicating that there had been some issues with the aircraft's pressurization controllers. During the previous 3 days, they had switched over from the primary to the backup, which seemed a little bit strange. Now, the Boeing 737 have 3 different controllers who takes care of the pressurization on board. 2 of them are completely automatic, and the third one is manual, meaning that the pilots themselves would need to operate the outflow valve in the back of the aircraft to control the pressurization using that one. Now, using the manual controller is very rare and also quite tricky. I've actually only had to do it once in real life, which I might actually tell you about in a different video, but during normal circumstances, the 2 automatic controllers will take turns on every other flight to control the pressure inside the aircraft. They do so using a preset pressurization schedule, designed to make the experience as comfortable as possible for everyone on board, and they are generally very good at what they do. But if a controller would encounter some kind of problem and not be able to follow that schedule as planned, well then it might switch over to the backup controller, and if that happened, we pilots would then be notified by a master caution light connected to an out-of-fail light and a green alternate light on the overhead panel. We would then just run through the associated non-normal checklist, which would just tell us to turn the controller switch over to alternate, which will remove the master caution and out-of-fail light, but the alternate light, the green light, would still remain, indicating that we would now only be working with 1 controller. So this is likely what had happened during those earlier flights, and during normal circumstances this doesn't necessarily mean that anything dangerous is going on at all. There might just be some type of internal fault in one of those controllers, and since there is redundancy through the backup and also the manual mode in worst case scenario, it doesn't actually require any immediate grounding of the aircraft, as long as the remaining controller works fine. Now, since this had happened on the 3 previous flights, Alaska Airlines had decided to limit this particular aircraft's operation to only over-land flights. Now, this might sound a bit strange since we know what ultimately happened. I mean, why would they not just ground the aircraft if they knew that something fishy was going on? But remember, issues with a pressurization controller does normally in no way indicate an issue with a door or an unsafe aircraft, unless it's also coupled with some other things like really strange noises or pressurization issues. So there was really no formal requirement to ground this aircraft, and Alaska Airlines had put in this restriction themselves as an abundant measure of caution in order to make sure that in case this aircraft would suffer some further pressurization issues and would then have to descend to 10,000 feet, they will have enough range to reach an alternate airport. I actually completely understand why Alaska Airlines reacted like this. New aircraft sometimes have some teething problems and some electrical issues which might include these controllers, and even if Alaska would have decided to ground this aircraft and to change the controllers, no one would have connected this issue with an unsafe door plug. Remember, those plugs were secured with 4 bolts, and because of that, they didn't even have any monitoring systems for them in the cockpit. They were supposed to be a part of the aircraft structure, and that's it. But having said that though, a recent lawsuit have indicated that some passengers that were sitting close to that specific left-hand door plug on some of the previous flights had actually heard a whistling noise, which they had reported to the cabin crew. The cabin crew had then allegedly also reported this to the pilots, but it's unclear if that happened on the flights where the controller problems were present or not. In any case, it was never entered into the tech log. Anyway, the 2 pilots that were now going to fly Flight 1282 likely discussed these entries and the restrictions that the aircraft had, but since it didn't really affect them, they just agreed to keep it in mind and to report it to maintenance if it happened again. It was late afternoon in January, so it was already starting to get dark outside as the cabin crew started boarding the 171 passengers who were scheduled for the flight. Now, the aircraft had seats for 178 passengers, which meant that a few seats remained empty, and by some miracle, those seats included 26 Alpha and Bravo. Now, the pilots who were working together on this flight were both very experienced. The captain, who was going to act as pilot flying, had over 12,700 hours of total time, and about half of that, 6,500 hours, on the Boeing 737. His first officer had 8,300 hours of total experience, of which about 1,500 hours were flown on the 737. Since the first officer was going to be pilot monitoring, she completed the walk-around whilst the captain was setting up the cockpit, and during the walk-around nothing looked out of the ordinary. When she returned to the cockpit, the captain briefed her for the departure, and together they finished up the last part of the cockpit setup and the checklists. Everything was looking just fine, and they were soon ready for pushback. At around 1750 local time, Alaska Airlines flight 1282 pushed back from their gate and started taxiing out for departure. The before takeoff checklist and associated briefs were soon completed, and at time 17:06 and 47 seconds, the captain lined up the aircraft on the runway, stabilized the engines at 40% N1, and then pressed the toga buttons, causing the aircraft to start accelerating down the runway. The rotation was normal, and after takeoff the gear was retracted and the aircraft soon initiated a left-hand turn down towards the southeast, whilst also climbing to their initial cleared altitude of 7,000 feet. They were soon handed over to the Portland departure frequency, where they were cleared to continue their climb to 15,000 feet, whilst also continuing on their cleared route. Now, in a Boeing 737, we pilots do several different pressurization checks of the cabin as we climb, since it's one of the most important life support systems that we have on board. An early detection of a problem in this system can help us to avoid a lot of issues later, so these checks are taken very seriously. The first of those checks is done as part of the after takeoff checklist, which is typically performed above 3,000 feet just after takeoff. This is also when we in my airline release the cabin crew to allow them to begin their service, but it's unclear if that's also the procedure with Alaska Airlines. Anyway, the next pressurization check is done as the aircraft passes 10,000 feet, and it's then repeated for each 10,000 feet we climb. In this case, there were no indications that the crew found any pressurization issues during these two initial checks. The cabin was climbing normally with around 800 to 1,000 feet per minute, and since the aircraft was climbing much faster than that, the differential pressure had now started building up inside the cabin, as it had done many times before. But this time, something very bad was now happening down the back of the aircraft cabin. As you all know by now, the 4 bolts that were supposed to lock the left mid-exit door plug in place were not there, which meant that the only thing really holding that plug in place was its own weight. As long as the door was actually seated in its guide fittings, it meant that all of those 12 stop fittings were aligned with the stop pads on the door frame, making it impossible for the door to move outwards. But during this flight, and possibly on several of the previous flights, the plug had started to move slightly upwards. We don't know exactly why that happened. It might have been due to natural vibrations in the airframe, turbulence, or even the effect of those assist springs that we talked about before, but in any case, for every movement the plug now made, the stop fittings and the pads had started moving further and further out of alignment with each other. The flight was soon instructed to contact the Seattle Center controller, and when the first officer did so, she was instructed to continue their climb to flight level 230, meaning 23,000 feet. This was also read back, and from the ATC tapes you can clearly hear that there is no stress in the voice of the first officer at this stage. Everything was completely normal. But that was soon about to change. After they passed 10,000 feet, the captain allowed the aircraft to accelerate to their economy climb speed of 271 knots as they continued down towards Ontario. The aircraft would have been climbing with around 2,500 feet per minute at this stage, and the cabin differential pressure had risen to 5.7 psi, or pounds per square inch. And just as a reference here, the normal diff pressure at higher cruise levels is 8.35 psi, which means that the diff pressure was at about 68% of what it would have been at cruise. But now, at time 17:12 and 33 seconds, the door plug had finally reached a position of no return. With an ear-deafening bang, the last couple of millimeters of the stop pads now deformed against the stop fittings and then completely gave in. Since there was now nothing holding it in place, the door now moved violently outwards and then down into the airstream, causing a force strong enough to rip it clean off the lower hinge fittings and throw it flying away from the aircraft. Out of sheer luck, the departing door didn't hit the aft stabilizer as it did so, which could have caused a lot more damage, and instead it just started tumbling down towards the countryside below. And so did a lot of other things. Since the departing plug had now caused an emergency exit-sized hole in the fuselage, the first thing that happened was that the surrounding wall panels and insulation followed the door out. Immediately, the excess pressure that had been built up inside of the aircraft now rushed towards that opening to try and equalize with the lower pressure outside. The ensuing wind that this caused was strong enough to rip a boy's shirt completely off his body, as well as push mobile phones out of people's hands and push anything that wasn't strapped down close to the opening out of the hole. The hurricane force wind ripped the seat padding from several seats, and it forced the seat back of seat 26 Alpha, which was next to the hole, to rotate forward and outward towards the opening by almost 20 degrees. But it wasn't only in the immediate vicinity of the hole that things were now happening. The depressurization force was strong enough to also buckle sidewalls throughout the aircraft, and again, by some type of miracle, the two seats next to the hole was unoccupied. If they hadn't been, or someone would have been walking in the aisle close to the plug when this happened, this story might have had a very different ending. In the cockpit, the effects of this explosive decompression were immediate and terrifying. The aircraft had been climbing through 14,830 feet when the plug disappeared, and the first indication of this was that the locked cockpit door suddenly just flung open as the air in the cockpit started rushing back towards the hole. The fact that the door lock would disengage and open in case of a rapid depressurization was actually a design feature, but one that Boeing had forgotten to tell us pilots about. Now, it does make perfect sense though, as you definitely don't want a huge diff pressure force to be acting on interior walls in the aircraft, but again, it would have been nice to know about it. In any case, the door flung open with such a force that it actually jammed into and deformed the forward lavatory door when it did so. As the air rushed out, it also flung the captain's head up and into his head-up display, and it almost tore the headset straight off his head. The first officer's headset was actually pulled off, and as this was happening, the cabin altitude alarm started blaring, announcing that the cabin altitude was now above 10,000 feet and therefore no longer safe. You can imagine the kind of shock that this would have caused, and I haven't even mentioned that everything that could get airborne in the cockpit now also likely did, including dust, dirt and loose items that would have lifted up from the floors and possibly gotten straight into the eyes of the pilots. Their ears would have immediately popped as the cabin altitude now rose from about 3,000 feet to 15,000 feet within a few seconds, and all of this would have been severely disoriented for anyone who wasn't trained for a thing like this. But these two pilots had been trained and had gone through years of recurrent training, which would have included rapid depressurizations and emergency descents at least every 3 years or so. As part of that training, they were taught that the very first thing that you need to do when they hear that cabin altitude warning is to don the oxygen masks. We do that before we do anything else, and that's because up at cruise altitude we only have a few seconds of time of useful consciousness before we lose mental control due to the extreme low pressures. Now, down at the altitude that they now were, they did have a little bit more time than that, but donning the mask was still the first thing that they did, and this is why the aircraft actually continued to climb another 1,500 feet before the captain stopped it. Now, I know that some people have reacted to this, but again, it makes perfect sense to me. You see, as the depressurization happened, the autopilot was engaged and likely set to VNAV climb. It took just over a minute for the pilots to orient themselves, get the masks out and onto their faces, found their headsets and then establish crew communication, and during that time the aircraft just continued to climb as if nothing had happened. After the masks were on and they could talk to each other, the next thing to do was for the captain to resume control, which in this case he already had, and to stop the climb. The captain would have then called for the rapid depressurization actions, and the first officer would then run through and verify a set of memory items, meaning checklist items that she would have had committed to memory. They include oxygen masks on 100%, crew communication established, pressurization mode selector to manual and for the outflow valve to close. Those first items are done to safeguard the consciousness of the pilots, establish communication between them, and then to verify if what caused the depressurization had something to do with the aircraft's own pressurization system. Remember, at this point they had no idea what had caused it. After this, they would have both checked if those initial actions actually solved the problem by verifying the cabin altitude and differential pressure, and in this case, the cabin altitude would have been close to where the aircraft altitude was, and the diff pressure would have been close to zero, meaning that those initial items had no effect. The aircraft was still depressurized. Now, what would normally happen in that case is that both pilots would agree that the cabin is still not under control, which would lead into an emergency descent. But note here that this is not an automatic decision to take. An emergency descent is a potentially hazardous maneuver due to traffic below them and the fact that they would now be descending without a clearance, so it's really important to take a few moments at this point to evaluate the situation, which is likely also what these two pilots did. The emergency descent then also includes memory items, which are divided into first officer and captain items. The first officer will start in the upper overhead panel to verify that the passenger oxygen masks have been dropped, which they actually do automatically when the cabin altitude goes above 14,000 feet. She would then have switched on the seatbelt sign. Again, that would have also automatically happened. This is just to verify that it has been done. And then continue to switch the engine start switches to continuous and all of the external lights on to make the aircraft as visible as possible to surrounding traffic, since it will now be descending without a clearance. She will then move down towards the center pedestal and squawk 7700 on the transponder, which transmits an emergency code to all ATC units around, and then make the first Mayday call to the controller, explaining the issue, telling the controller that they will be descending to 10,000 feet or MSA, whatever is higher, and also request the local QNH if needed. As the first officer is doing her items, the captain would start by announcing the emergency descent to the cabin crew using the PA. This would cause all of the cabin crew who are still up and around to sit down immediately wherever they are in the cabin and then put an oxygen mask on if they haven't already. He would then set 10,000 feet or the minimum safe altitude, whichever is higher, on the mode control panel, select level change, and then consider turning right or left in order to avoid descending into traffic below on the same airway, and also possibly increase the speed to maximum. But it will only increase the speed if he is sure that the structural integrity of the aircraft is not in doubt. If he is not sure of that, he should keep the speed that they're currently on, which is exactly what he also did in this case. After that, he can just let his hand go down and help the thrust levers back into idle, raise the speed brake lever, and once that's done, he can get his hand up to the mode control panel again and fine-tune any of the values. Doing things this way will cause the aircraft to start an immediate and rapid descent down to breathable air, and this procedure is something that we really practice a lot in the simulator to make sure that it sticks to memory in case it would ever happen in real life, just because of the dramatic nature of this failure. Now in this case, we are still not completely sure exactly which steps of the rapid depressurization and the emergency descent procedure that were actually completed, since they were already at a relatively low altitude when it happened. We do know that the vertical speed didn't go up to very high values that you would expect from a full emergency descent, and the speed was also not increased. And we also know that the oxygen masks were done, because you can clearly hear that from the subsequent emergency ATC call that the first officer did.
Alaska, trouble clear, declare an emergency, we're descending down to 10,000, we'll see pressurized.
And here comes another thing that I really want to try and explain here. Communicating with an oxygen mask on is really difficult. Not only did they have to deal with the incredible noise from the cabin, which you can also clearly hear from the ATC tapes, they also had these diluter demand features on their mask, meaning that every time that they would breathe in, a valve would open and push oxygen into their mask right beside the mic. This in turn means that they would have to try and communicate between each breath, because every time that they would be breathing in, they would basically sound like Darth Vader running a marathon. In theory, once the aircraft is in a more controlled descent, there are also emergency checklists to be read by the pilot monitoring, and that's also quite difficult to do with these masks on for the exact same reason. So the fact that the communication between the crew and air traffic control was slightly less than perfect in this case also makes perfect sense. As the pilots were working on getting the aircraft down to a cabin altitude lower than 10,000 feet, the situation in the back of the aircraft would have been quite chaotic. All of the masks had dropped as per design, and the way that they work is by the passenger putting them on and then pulling down on the hose. When any of the 4 hoses per unit is pulled down, this activates the oxygen generator inside, which combines chemicals to start producing oxygen for a period of about 13 minutes or so. This is calculated to be enough time to allow the pilots to get the aircraft down from even its maximum altitude using the procedure that I just described. The passenger masks will mix oxygen from the generator with outside air, and that's why they're not used in case of smoke in the cabin. They really wouldn't help, instead they would just feed whatever fire is causing that smoke with more oxygen. And when we're talking about smoke, these generators produce a lot of heat when the chemical reaction is active, so it's not uncommon that a smell of burning might also appear in situations like this, which is of course quite scary but completely normal. But in this case, people seem to have stayed remarkably calm under the circumstances. Mobile videos taken from the event is showing people quietly sitting strapped into their seats whilst looking out through the hole in their aircraft at the glowing lights passing below them. Now, we don't know how much communication took place between the cockpit and the cabin crew, but with the noise level in the cabin we can assume that there wasn't much. One of the cabin crew attendants eventually managed to loosen the cockpit door, which had jammed into the lavatory door, and then closed it to allow the pilots some lower noise levels and help to concentrate. The aircraft descended down to 9,000 feet initially, where the cabin altitude warning finally stopped, and after that, once the associated emergency checklists were completed, the crew briefed and set up for an immediate return back towards Portland. As part of the descent, the aircraft had turned left, which meant that it was pretty soon over the extended descent line for runway 28 left, the same runway that they had actually taken off from. The controller, who from the communication can be heard being a little bit skeptical about the aircraft's ability to descend fast enough from that position, soon cleared them for the ILS, which the crew eventually also accepted. Now, here, it's also worth pointing out that in a situation like this, the pilots have to weigh the potential risk of staying airborne longer and descend slower against the discomfort that the passengers will now have to endure during yet another fast and unpressurized descent. The captain, who in this case didn't know just how serious the damage to his aircraft actually was, chose to get it down to the ground quickly. This would have meant configuring the aircraft almost immediately and then descending with a quite high rate of descent in order to stabilize the aircraft on final. The approach was then flown without any further mishaps, even though it must have been a terrible ordeal for the passengers down the back. Remember, not only would it have been incredibly noisy, it would also have been quite cold, since this happened basically in a late January afternoon, where the temperatures on the ground was only about 10 degrees Celsius. On top of that, a normal pressurized descent would be about 500 feet per minute, whilst this descent was much faster, which would have been felt in everyone's ears and sinuses. But anyway, at time 17:26 and 46 seconds, the aircraft touched down safely on runway 28 left in Portland and then taxied into the stand. Unfortunately, the crew forgot to pull the CVR circuit breaker, and since the aircraft was kept powered up after the event, the 2 hours of continuous loop recording on the cockpit voice recorder kept recording, meaning that the records of this flight was soon overwritten. But out of the 177 people on board, only 7 passengers and 1 flight attendant received minor injuries, and the rest were completely unharmed, which must be seen as a fantastic outcome given the circumstances. Now, due to the dramatic nature of this event and the fact that it happened to a Boeing 737 MAX, the accident received instant worldwide attention. This video is based on the different FAA briefings, the preliminary report, as well as some articles which I will obviously link to below, but we will likely learn even more details when the final report comes out. But I felt that it was important to share this video now anyway, to give you a better picture of what we know so far, and I want to reiterate that this had nothing to do with the design of the Boeing 737 MAX itself. Instead, it looks like an internal Boeing and Spirit quality issue. As a precaution, Alaska Airlines grounded its fleet of 737 MAX 9 airplanes immediately to inspect the mid-exit door plugs on all of their aircraft. These inspections began on Saturday morning, January 6, 2024, and the FAA issued an emergency airworthiness directive on the same day, requiring all operators of 737 MAX 9 airplanes to conduct specific inspections before any airplane would be returned back to service. The FAA is now also digging deeper into the quality management and safety management programs inside both Boeing and Spirit, and has, as an initial precaution, limited Boeing's production capacity of new 737 MAXes until the quality issues has been dealt with. Now, if you want to learn more about that, as well as keeping up to date with current events, I recommend you to subscribe to my sister channel, Mentour now, and check out my Mentor Pilot app, as well as my website, mentorpilot.com. You can support the work that we do here by sending a super thanks using the dollar button here below, buying maybe some merch, or maybe even joining my awesome Patreon crew and interact with me directly on an upcoming Zoom hangout. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.